Hello everyone, this is Roy, and in this simple scene, I'm going to demonstrate how you can easily make 360 animated videos that you can upload to Ulio. Now, this is a simple scene. You can see I didn't bother refining the lighting. This is rendered out of V-Ray. And I'm just going to leave it really basic because this is just a quick tutorial. Now, the first thing I want to say about this 360 video that you're watching right now in Ulio is that it was not rendered out as a single animation piece. The idea here is to be able to render a 360 panoramic in stereo or not in stereo, but to be able to render it in layers to cut down on the render time, because the render time can be quite large, as we know, when you're rendering Ulio type spherical panoramics, especially if you're rendering both a left and a right eye, which you can do for these 360 videos that we upload into Ulio. I'm only going to render for one eye, but you can render for both. Just know, of course, that your render time will go up. So how do we go about creating this layered? So the building itself, this rendering of the building and the carpet and everything that you see, minus the teapot and the teapot's shadow, was rendered as a still image. Your classic still image rendering that you've done out of V-Ray and uploaded into Ulio. Just a single rendering. But when I rendered the building, the teapot was not there, because that's the animated object that we want to have matted into the scene. And if it's a very long animation, having to render the building, the ceiling, the carpets, all the objects and ancillary things that you have in your scene can really kill your render time. So the idea is not everything is going to animate. Maybe it's just a chair. Maybe it's a workstation going up. Maybe it's a very simplified kit of parts. And you only want to render that animation and be able to do it in a time that won't take weeks in order to process. Now, this is going to be 3D Studio Max in V-Ray in this example, not Twinmotion, because the idea is we want to have animations of objects, and we all know animation in Twinmotion is extremely primitive. You can open some doors, you can rotate some objects, you can move them up and down, but you can't go through the complex style animations that we have inside of 3D Studio. And I'm not using Vantage. This is all just traditional rendering as we move forward. So the first thing we're going to look at is the values inside of Ulio of when you go to render this. What's the setup? So when I look here in the scene assets of Ulio, and I would go to the file compatible formats. Normally you're looking here. You have your standard stereomonoscopic or stereoscopic cube maps, and we're all used to doing cube mapping. You can't use cube mapping. What you have to use is stereoscopic or monoscopic video settings. Now, I'm using just the VR360 mono. You can do both left and right, but you have to decide, am I doing stacked that I see here, or am I doing side by side? You can do either or, and when you upload your video into Ulio, it will ask you, is this a stacked left and right? It is a stacked up and down, or is it a mono? It doesn't know. It doesn't pick up automatically and say, oh, I know what this is. You have to let it know when you're importing. So notice also, too, that there is a minimum resolution, but not a maximum resolution. I'm going to go with the minimum 3840, 2160 pixels. And when I encode this out of Adobe Premiere, I'll be using the H.264 as an MP4. All right. And only up to 400 megabytes. So that's the other thing too, is be aware that if you do a side-by-side or a stacked stereo and you go with a high resolution, that's going to increase the file size, and you may go through a lot of work and then you end up with something you can't even upload. So I'll show you the file size of this MP4 that I've made, which is only like 3 seconds long. It literally is only like around 99 frames. So I'll show you that. It's a little bit longer than 3, but you basically get it. Okay, so we'll be coming back to this right before we go to upload. Got it. Go ahead and hit got it. So let's jump into 3D Studio, and I'll show you my extremely simplified scene. I didn't add in any extra lights except for one, a traditional spotlight, because I wanted to talk about the shadow matting that you're going to need to be able to do, because it's one thing to render the building by itself, it's another to render the teapot, but how do you make it look like the teapot is grounded to the floor or walls if you want to have shadows being casted on other objects in the scene? As my simplification, I'll only show you the shadow on the floor. I'm not going to bother with the walls or other objects. That would make things a little bit more complex, and I'm not going to worry about that in this very quick tutorial. So I've got a simple camera. I've got my simple light. Everything else is just environmental GI. You can even see with all the spots and speckles in the background image that I went with a very, very low irradiance map global illumination setting for this. Just wanted to get through the tutorial. So what do we do? What is step one? Well, step one is you lay out your scene. Get your animation ready. Do everything that you need to do as if you were rendering a traditional film. And then, of course, get your camera in the scene. Set up the rendering resolution. Set up your lighting. Get everything ready as if you were just going to do a standard still image rendering for Ulio, except don't render it as a cube map. So let me go into the render settings and let's take a look at some of the settings here. I'll let this dialog pop up. All right, so I've got the render settings up, and let's take a look here under the V-Ray tab. You want to use the spherical setting. Now be careful, don't use spherical panorama. I know we think that's the right one, but actually it's not. If you use spherical panorama, you're going to get a weird effect at the very bottom and top of your screen. Everything will draw in like going into a black hole kind of an effect. So you want to stick with straight up spherical, but you want to do an override field of view of 360 when you go to do the rendering. And then if I look at common, you can see that I'm just using the regular max frame buffer, and the render size is the 3840 by 2160. I'm just using the basic setting. I'm rendering out here, looks like 0 to 100 frames. I just did the active segment. So that'll give you an idea of something as simple as this scene that I'm rendering with only 100 frames, how big that file is. As they said, it can only be up to 400 megabytes as an H.264. And of course, if you're a Premiere person, which we will get into at the end, you can apply different compression values to that Premiere H.264 to try to crush that file size down even more. But we have to go with the 3840, 2160, and we are saving out the files, as you can see here, teapot JPEG. That I'll get to in a minute when we talk about the render elements and that composition. So first thing is get your scene all set up. Get your camera in there. Get your lights. Get everything ready. Get your objects animated, ready to go. Second, now, hide. Well, you don't have to hide, but go to the animating elements. Like for me, it's just the sphere. And go into, for me, this is one way I do it. You can just straight up hide them from the scene if you want. You can just go in and say, hide, right? And then unhide them. That's one way to keep them from being rendered. But what I want to do is I simply want to go into the object properties here, and let me drag this over. And I'm just going to say not renderable. That way they're still in the scene. I don't have to worry about hiding and unhiding them and opening up another dialog. I'm just going to say, leave them there, just non-renderable. But there are certainly multiple other ways to say non-renderable. So let me just hit OK. Now, you can see from my leftover scene, there is a background in there, but you won't have one when you begin. So let me open up my rendering environment. And let me just turn this off. So you won't have any maps at first. You're just going to have a generic, probably a generic white background. That will be your first effect. So I'll just leave that there. And again, in my rendering settings, which I'll go ahead and let me bring that back up again. In my rendering settings for V-Ray, just to confirm this is one of the most basic render setups possible, irradiance map, light cache. Again, you don't need to use these. You set up your scene how you normally want to render your 360. Do everything, even do your test renderings as still images. Get your scene set up exactly the way you want it. No special tricks, just the camera, when it's rendered, needs to be that spherical. So I'm just using extremely basic values, very low, just to make this fast. in here. And in the V-Ray and in the environment, I am only using my GI environment. But you, again, set yours up however you want it to be. Those are your settings. The only thing you got to do is just do spherical. All right, so let's continue on. I'm just going to close this. And I have no environment yet. And so now what we would do with the camera set, with the set to the spherical, and we've got everything ready to go. Now's when we go in and we render, and we will get that spherical image. So let me go ahead and pull up that spherical image and show you what it ends up looking like. So let's do a view image here. And here it is right here. I just called it a background and I made it a PNG file. And there it is. Again, don't judge my lighting and my color. This is just a tutorial. I know it looks hideous. It's just to get the point across. I'm laughing at it as I look at it. So here it is, a standard spherical, not spherical panorama, spherical rendering that we're going to create that's going to be used inside of Ulio as part of this video. So these materials, I didn't do anything with them. They're straight out of CET is where this scene came from. I didn't do anything except the material on the teapot. I did change that to V-Ray. But everything else, and the carpet, I think is V-Ray. Everything else is straight up whatever CET conversion happened to be, because I am just doing a tutorial. And there you can see without the teapot, there is the light that's being casted from that spotlight. Okay, so let me just close this. So we go in and we render out just that one image. So you're going to render, if this is a multi-scene frame Ulio event, if this is a multiple scene image Ulio event, you're probably going to have 4 or 5 cameras rendering in different locations. Perfect. Just go around, render all your statics, but render them without the furniture that's going to need to be animated. Right? Render everything else as your static images. Make sure you render them as spherical. Can't say that enough because we're so used to doing the cubic map. That won't work. It's got to be spherical. All right, perfect. We render that. When we come back, now we're going to set up in order to render this animating teapot. So the first thing we do is we go into our environment, and let me pull that back up, and we want to make that a background image. So I'll go to environment. I'm just going to check it on, and let me pull up the material editor so that you can see here's that bitmap that's loaded in the environment. You can see that I'm using screen mapping. Trust me, don't use spherical. Some of you might go, oh, wait, that should be spherical environment. No, screen mapping. Now, why would you even turn that on? What reason is there to even have a background image? Why not remain white? And the answer is this. So we still have to deal with the edge color, the anti-aliasing color all around the edge of my very pink teapot. If I don't have a background image there and I render this teapot against pure black or pure white background environment, what will happen in the resulting composite when we do what's called matte tracking inside of Premiere is I'm going to get a halo around that object. I'll get, in the case of a white background, a white halo around the teapot. Or if it was a black background, I'll get a black halo around that teapot. I want to get the perfect blending. I want that anti-aliasing between the alpha track matting of the teapot on the rendered background image to be the perfect blend as if it was there in the first place. So that is why we have to have that environment in the background of the rendering. So when I render this, that teapot is going to render against that background image, and I'll do a single frame rendering so that you can see it. It's going to go by really fast. And if I don't have an image in the background that's set to map perfectly to that spherical camera, I'll get haloing. Again, make that screen mapping as a material. Don't make your background image anything other than screen environment. That's the key there, screen environment. All right. Now, so this is the material of my carpet. So let's go back and let's render out this scene with the teapot against the environment. But before I do that, I have to make sure that the building will not be seen. So I'm going to take the building, and let me close this group because I have it as a group. So my whole building is a group, including the floor. I'm going to right-click on the object properties, and what I want to say is this is not visible to the camera, but I do want it to be renderable, and I do want it to be visible to reflection, refraction. I want it to be visible to receive shadows. I want it to be visible to cast shadows. Everything else is on, except I don't want it to be visible to the camera, because that way I don't have that long render time. If I say visible to the camera, then this whole video tutorial is moot. I shouldn't even be doing it. So let's turn off that visible to camera and hit OK. And I will now render the teapot. I'm going to make sure it's visible to the camera. So let me pull that up. You are now renderable and everything is on. And so I'm going to render it against the background image, and let's see what it looks like. And I know it's going to be missing a shadow on the floor because the floor is right now part of that group and it is not renderable. So let me bring up my render dialog box. So here's the render dialog box, and I'm going to be talking about render elements in a minute. So I'm just going to turn that off, and I want to render a single, and I don't want to save it to a file. Again, this is my tutorial file. This is my test image. So I just want to straight up render this. So let's hit render. And let's just see what we get. All right. So it is rendering. There it is. That was the last image, right? It was the background image that I rendered out. So that's what you saw last in the frame buffer. So now it's rendering the teapot on the background image, and I know the placement is exactly where it's supposed to be spherically. Now, this is a good reason why you do screen mapping, right? Because I've already rendered the background as spherical. So if it's a background image, I don't need to sphere the sphere. That's why the mapping coordinates of the environmental background image is left as screen mapping. It's already been rendered with the sphere setting. Why tell the bitmap to be sphere again? Leave it as screen. So here we can see I've got a teapot, and it is sort of back in the background, but there's no shadow at all, and I really want to see the shadow. So what I need to do now is go to I'll just move this over to the side. I need to go to my building. Let me open that group. All right, open. And I'm going to pick on the floor because the floor needs to be renderable. So let's go into its properties. And the floor is visible to the camera. Everything is renderable, but the whole group of the building was not visible to the camera, but now the floor is. Now, if I render this now, and I'll just go ahead and hit render. So here's the carpet rendering, right? And it's overlaying the background. So this is what it should look like. If I render this, but I don't do anything with the floor material, I'm only rendering the teapot and the floor, I'm going to see the teapot. I'm going to see its shadow on the floor here. And actually, you know what? Let's go to an earlier frame. Let's get this thing a little bit more in the foreground here. So I'm going to go to, let's say roughly here about 50, and let me hit render. Let's bring it a little bit closer to the camera because this is animating, moving around. I want to move it a little bit closer. So yeah, there we go. So there now we got the teapot a little bit more centered in the stage here. So the initial first pass of the rendering, and now it should go through on the render side, and we'll get the shadow and the lights turned on. So here we go. Ooh, there we go. So here's the teapot rendering on the floor, and we can see the effect of the shadow when the teapot encroaches inside of that spotlight. And it looks good on the floor, but the problem is if I render the floor along with the teapot, then the floor is covering up more than it should be covering up. And I'm rendering the floor twice, which I don't really want to do that. And if I look at the alpha, I can see it's intruding upon the alpha. I only want to render the teapot. I don't want to see the floor, but I do want to see the shadow of the floor. So now let me close this. Now let me go back to the material editor. Now let me show you that you're going to need one of these guys. You're going to need a V-Ray material wrapper. So you got to go in with your floor material, go down to V-Ray, find yourself a V-Ray material wrapper, and you need to drop it in the scene, right? So there's a blank V-Ray material wrapper. So a V-Ray material wrapper says, tell me whatever base material you want to have in the scene. And then I will use the base material as part of my submaterial. So if I drag this in here, I can see I've connected the carpet to the base material. Now, I don't need a second one, so I'm going to delete this and go back to the main one. So what changes do I need to make? Because I want the floor to pass its global illumination off to the building. I definitely want that, right? I want to see that happen, but I don't need it to receive any global illumination because I don't want to double light the floor. Remember, the floor was already rendered, but I also want it to be a matte surface. So the key elements are, let it generate GI to give that GI to the teapot. You don't need to let it receive additional GI. I'm going to go matte surface on the floor, meaning that I can now go to the alpha contribution and say -1, meaning don't contribute to the alpha channel. I want it to be negative, nothing's there. This is a carpeted floor, so I don't need reflection, refraction, so I don't need that. But I do want it to receive shadows, and I want the shadows to affect the alpha. So you need to have matte surface, -1, generate GI, shadows, yes, affect alpha, yes. Everything else I'm leaving the same. Now I'll take this wrapper and I'll assign it to the floor, and it should go back to that blue color. And that's what you saw at the very beginning of the video. So now let's render it and let's see what we get. So I'll close the material editor, come back here, hit the render button, and let's see what we get in the rendering. So now what I'm hoping to see here is the floor won't be brown anymore. The floor will be invisible because what I see as a floor now is actually the background image. That's not the rendered floor. That is the background floor. Now, one thing that's going to be a little disconcerting at the beginning is you're going to think, holy moly, that is a super dark shadow. Well, the final one will not. If you scroll back earlier in this video, when I rendered out the teapot in the building as if I wasn't doing any animation at all, you may have noticed that that shadow was much more opaque. It wasn't like totally 100% solid. But the effect of this override material, this material wrapper that we're using, is the alpha matting on that floor may look like it's going to pick up a very dark shadow. You have to sort of ignore that. That's one of the tricks around understanding the matting and why when we say, well, how do I pull out that? I want that semi-transparent shadow. It shouldn't look like that. Where am I going to get that from? Where do I pick up that shadow, that real shadow element? Well, that's where render elements come into play. And you want to have 3 render elements set up when you go to render the teapot. You want to have V-Ray shadows. So the V-Ray shadows are what is going to have the actual true shadow color, because shadows can look a little bit color. Like if they're on the teapot, they might be a dark purple. On the floor, it might be a little bit of a dark brown. So you need that V-Ray shadows. That's the color of the shadows, not the opacity, but the color of the shadow. All right. V-Ray raw shadows is what we're going to use as what we call a track matter. That is the alpha channel for just the shadow track alone. It has nothing to do with the teapot. It is the alpha for the shadows. So V-Ray raw shadow is the alpha to the V-Ray shadow. And then, of course, we need the V-Ray alpha. That's the alpha matte of just the teapot by itself and nothing else. So if I go back to the image and look at here, you can see that's the V-Ray alpha. Right? We need that. That gets us the albedo component, if you want to call it albedo, but there's reflection and everything else. That gets us the teapot. So we need the teapot. We get that from the raw rendering, right? That's set up in common. That'll give us the raw teapot color, and the background will be part of it, right? No worries, right? Our render element of V-Ray alpha cuts away everything except for the teapot. The V-Ray shadow element gets us the shadow colors, right? Is it brown tinted? Is it purple tinted? It's really grayscale, but there's color. There's color. Just trust me. And then there's the raw shadow, which is the alpha to the V-Ray shadow. So I've got all these turned on, right? Enabled. I'm just saving them out as JPEGs. And I go in and say, go ahead and turn on the active segment. Go ahead and save my file. And boom, I send it to the render farm. So the render farm cranked out these, it's only 101 frames, right? 0 to 100. Cranked it out in no time because my settings were really low. But it also means that when it renders this, when the farm renders this image, it doesn't have to calculate the reflection maps of this glass or the reflection maps of, anything, or what's happening with the ceiling, what's happening with these cabinets. Or if I had other ancillary furniture in here, it doesn't care about any of the rendering elements of that. Yeah, it will kind of pick up the global illumination. It will pick up, say, the ability for other objects to occlude shadows or lighting, but it's not going to have to render them. So we're conserving some rendering time because everything except the floor is non-renderable in this scene. Now, I could go on and say, if you could, in the most advanced sense, and I'm not going to worry about it in this video, but when we talk about those materials, I mean, if you wanted the ultimate of all ultimates, what you would actually do, and I don't really recommend this, but if you're crazy, go for it. In order to get the perfect matte, every material in the scene would be, except for your animating objects, would all be pumped into a V-Ray base material just like this one. That would give you the ultimate, but that's a lot of work. And I don't think you really need it because remember, this is a 360 video. Things are the animating objects are going to be animating. So yeah, we're going to give away a little bit of, ambient occlusion. We're going to give away some values of global illumination transmission, but the results are not really warranted for that. If you're doing this, the people will be just going, wow, you were able to create a 360 animation, and it didn't take, 3 days, in order to render because you only rendered that one element. And if the product manager or the salesperson said, can you make a few changes? You're not like going, oh my God, the rendering took, out of Twinmotion or out of Max. When I rendered the whole thing, every frame took, an hour to produce at that resolution. This is, give me a week and I'll give you a new one. So you don't have to worry about that. All right, I'm only doing the carpet. You can do more objects. Like you might want to say okay, maybe the ceiling and the walls, maybe those you throw in a wrapper. That's not too much work. Take your ceiling material, take your wall material, throw those in a wrapper. But for every other object in the scene, yeah, I don't really know. So back to elements. They're all turned on, ready to go. I've got my common set. I'm ready to save. I go ahead and submit this to the render farm. And when it's done, what we will get, and I'll open up here. Let me jump to that, is you're going to get a bunch of images. So you already have your background image, but here are my images. So here are all my rendered frames. I have my Teapot V-Ray Alpha, right? That's going to allow me to cut out the teapot. You can see in this very, very tiny little sample here. Can I make that bigger? Yeah. And if we scroll down, we're going to see that I have my raw shadow. That is the alpha to the V-Ray shadow, which will come next. There's the V-Ray shadow. See, it's more of a color. You can't see the brown because it's just not showing up the contrast, but it is there, right? And you can see it's even a purple shadow color, right? That's why we want to do a V-Ray shadow layer, and then the V-Ray raw becomes this alpha. And then finally, we should see just the rendered teapots, right? And yes, the background is part of that, but remember, the alpha is going to cut that background out. All right, so perfect. Now, last thing, I'm ready to set up Premiere. So let me open up Premiere here. I already have it open. And let me go ahead and open this scene, and I'll show you how we stack it. All right, I got the Premiere scene open, and you can see that I have 5 video channels loaded up in the project. First, we have the original background image. When I set up this Premiere scene, when I started with this, all I did was bring in the background and then just drag it in the first video channel. And that automatically created the first scene graph and automatically set the resolution. I'm not going to teach you Premiere in this. I'm going to assume you've got some Premiere knowledge. So I'm going to push forward and assume you're good with that. So I know that when I do a media export of this background scene, as I call it, it will be the right resolution when I render it out. So I got the background image, right? The same image. I'll turn all these off. The same image that I used when I did the rendering inside of Max. Same background image that it had. So the next thing that I add in is the rendering of the teapot. Now, when I first put this in, and let me just turn off the track mat for a moment. Actually, you know what I'll do? I'll delete it so you can see what we have. So this is right here. This is the rendering of the teapot with a very, very dark black that you saw in Max. And I don't want that. Yes, I got it. That was a side effect of seeing the rendering and why I need to cut that teapot out of that background. But I know that since I rendered the teapot against the background, no halo. So when I use the alpha, the V-Ray alpha as the track mat, and I cut this out, I know I won't get a halo around the teapot being a halo against like white if I would not have had a background image in Max. So how do I do that? Well, what you do in order to tell that an object, a animation clip, that you want it to be track matted is you stack somewhere in your scene graph an alpha track mat above it. Now I put it right above it. So first I dragged in my teapot JPEG as a video sequence, right? Dragged that in. Then I dragged in my V-Ray alpha as another image sequence, one on top of each other. So if I look at it right now, you can see there's the alpha image, without anything happening to it, sitting right on top of the teapot. But I want the alpha image to not really be present in Premiere. I want this only to be a track mat to the channel beneath it. So let me go to the teapot channel. Let me go to video effects over here in the upper right, and I'm going to scroll down to the keying option, and in keying option, there's track mat key. So I'm going to drag this track mat on top of the teapot video sequence. And in here, I'm going to not use Matte Alpha. You actually want to use what we call Matte Luma. And with Matte Luma, it says, what video channel above me do I use for Luma track matting? And the answer is, well, it looks like it's video 3. So let me go to video 3 and bam, instantly you can see the teapot has been alpha matted. So there's different ways of doing it in Photoshop, but in Premiere, it's track matting. So this layer now that you see here actually no longer shows up. It's still there, and I don't need to turn it off, right? I don't need to toggle the track output. You just leave it on, right? Leave it there. Now for the shadows, it was the same thing. I dragged in, and here, I'll delete the track mat off of the shadow. Let's just delete that, clear it. All right, and let's turn it on. So that's the shadow image sequence, right? You can see that purpling that's going on with the teapot, and you can't really see the shadow on the floor, but that's the color of the V-Ray shadow. And so I dragged above it the V-Ray raw shadow, which has the opacity value to apply to the V-Ray shadow. So I go back to V-Ray shadow, my video sequence 4, drag a track mat on top of that, and go ahead and say Luma, and I'm going for video 5, and bam, and there it is. I can see there is the perfect track matting. I have the teapot rendered in as a layer inside of the building. I can see that I picked up reflections and everything else because that came from the environment, background that's there, right? And I can see that, wow, it's looking pretty good. I can see that looks like it was actually there. Now, if you were to render this out as a straight up normal rendering, you might see a little bit more ambient occlusion. You might see a little bit more going on with the colorization of it. So we are giving up, yes, quality. I'm going to repeat that. But most people are never going to know you gave up a little bit of quality for the gain of being able to render your animating elements separate from the entire scene, which you can change your qualities. Like if I really wanted to do this right, I would have maxed out my quality for the background image. Then if I was looking for some rendering time conservation, then maybe I can lower my irradiance map or my brute force or whatever I'm using to be not quite so hard inside of Max, and even sped up the rendering, because most people are going to see the entire scene, right? And we give up a little bit of quality content of the textures and the lighting on the animating objects. Because remember, they're moving. They're moving. And since they're moving, people don't have enough time to really stare at them. You don't want to give up too much quality. But remember, those are trade-offs that we're going to do in order to wow them. So once we got it with this, we basically go in and we say, hey, I want to export my media. So in the export media, I'm just doing H.264. I'm just doing an MP4. And for me, you can see I'm letting the source, which is that 3840 by 2160. And as far as the codecs, I don't have any audio in here, so I don't have to worry about that. But if we look at the multiplexer, I'm just doing MP4 standard, right? Nothing really strange. And I'm just doing hardware encoding. And I'm not going to worry about these. VBR1 pass. So, I'm not teaching you Premiere and video encoding. Not sure if you want to know it, we can create another video for that on the perfect settings. But you go with whatever settings you're used to using when it comes to making animations. But this time you're going to make it an H.264 MP4. All right. So there it is. You hit export. And that will give you the MP4. So now I can go back to Ulio and resume here and just drag and drop this in. So you'll take your scene that you have rendered, your MP4 file, and if I go back one, say, here is my MP4, right, not max, there it is right there. There's my MP4 file. And that's what I want to drag and drop into Ulio or YouTube, if you want to put it in YouTube, whatever you want to send it. I drag and drop this in. It's going to take longer for it to process. Oh, you know what I wanted to do? I wanted to look at that file size. What's the properties of this? Because remember, we have a limit of 400 meg. So, wow, 1.9 meg. I think I'm good, right? I think I have a lot more to go. That H.264, I think I could probably put a 30-second animated sequence or maybe even a minute-long animated sequence up there. It's going to be a long upload to Ulio, but man, just 2 meg? I can go up to 400? Not bad. Not bad at all. All right, so we drag it up there, we let it process, and let's launch this baby. And when we launch it, we'll see that it immediately is animating. And I'll show you how to do some changes in Ulio and how to set that. So there it is. That's the 360 composited video out of Premiere. And you can see that when someone comes to this scene, it's animating. Now, I did monoscopic, not stereoscopic. Again, that's totally up to you based on your render time. But there it is. It's animating. And it's moving around. And of course, resolution, you can up your resolution if you want to up your resolution instead of the base resolution that I used. So whether they're on their phone or whether they're on a computer, you have animating objects in a 360 where you didn't have to render the entire scene and everything with it with the animation embedded and take forever and a day to do that. Now, let me go back to the editing of the project because I do want to show you in the 3 ellipsoids here. You have playback settings. So that's important to make sure you know what your playback settings are because there is a default. Remember the 3 ellipsoids were my mouse. Go here. We have matte sample, right? 360 video loop is endless or play it once or jump to a selected scene. I don't have any jumps. So you can put jumps in here. Of course, I haven't done any jumps, right? So I'm not going to worry about the jumps for right now. So I'm just going to leave it as endless loop. And in the 3 dots, you also have video thumbnail. So you can have a thumbnail, whatever you want your thumbnail to be, you can select any part of the animation to be a thumbnail. So I'll select this frame and that'll be my thumbnail. So it'll refresh the original thumbnail to be a different frame in the animation if I want to use a different frame in the animation. And that really comes in effect when the animation stops. All right, so let me just hit close. I'll just let that process. And that's basically it. It's reprocessing the video because it wants to know where the thumbnail, where it's starting. And that's all it takes. So again, this is one of probably a dozen ways to do alpha matting. I just wanted to come up with a real quick example here of how you could do it. I'm sure there are many other techniques and even refinements upon this technique to make it even better. And if you know of any refinements or any techniques, throw it in the comments for the video and let me know what you think we can do better with this in order to improve the blending quality of the so-called teapot in the so-called building. But hopefully this will help you out a bit. And thanks a bunch and enjoy.